Do you watch the Diary of a CEO podcast?
I don't watch it in terms of the whole thing, but I see a lot of the clips on YouTube.
Yeah, I think that says it all. I think I've probably watched one or two all the way through when I first came across it. And obviously it's phenomenally popular, isn't it? Millions or however many people follow it. But you're right, I don't think, it's been a long time since I watched one all the way through. But does that matter, do you think?
Well, I don't know. I think if there was a guest on that I really wanted to hear, I would. But I think they're very good at giving you the salient points from
the short or the clip.
The sensationalised points.
Do you think you've got a better, or has it had a greater effect on your thoughts about Steve Bartlett or his guests?
I think it's both. I think you obviously, with Steve Bartlett, you can get that quality of guest on.
Mm.
And then the guest is probably going to be a little bit subjective in terms of whether or not they're in a field that you're interested in or not. And it may even be, they had the chap on talking about AI that I can't remember who he is, but what he said about AI was quite interesting.
Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it? That the message gets remembered, but not the messenger. So if it's someone going on there to try and promote their expertise, then that might be lost on them.
But then I guess I could just Google or YouTube.
You could watch it again.
CEO AI and he'll come up and I could look him up if I needed to, isn't it? Yeah. So it's kind of, do you retain that information?
Yeah.
Well,
I do remember the one, the guy who runs Brewdog, was it James Watt or whatever his name is, talking about how he grew up as a captain of a fishing boat or something and how he had a pretty tough early career and how that formed him. You got a backstory there that you wouldn't pick up anywhere else, and I remembered it.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if I would have got that from the shorts and the clips that they put out. What I am impressed by is it Grace Andrews? Is that her name?
Could be.
She's the lady that runs all their social media. And this is one for the marketing nerds out there, but she seems to be quite a powerhouse behind the whole thing that's driven it, obviously with Steve Bartlett's personality, but to the megalithical podcast that it is today.
And I think, she actually put an interview out the other day with somebody who, again, can't remember it, but you remember the subject.
I remember her more than I remember him, to be fair. She had a lot of good stuff to say.
And around how they go about testing their content.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, they're a 4 million, 5 million subscriber. They've got a data set there that they can really,
Well, maybe we should do a podcast about testing then.
We should do.
Okay, let's do that. Hello and welcome to the SME Growth Podcast from Wellmeadow. I'm Dave Parry and this is Richard Buckle.
Hello.
And as you may have heard in our little preamble there, we thought it'd be good to talk a little bit about testing in the sense of marketing testing. Okay, so testing your messages and all that sort of stuff. So we've got a few points that we wanted to cover on this, but we were starting there with the thought of the Diary of a CEO and how they do their testing.
Yeah, and I suppose just to give a little bit of background, you're an engineer.
I am an engineer.
I am a scientist.
Are you always an engineer? I was an engineer.
Once a scientist, always a scientist.
Marketing consultancy company that drives marketing.
But I think I think anyone who has been through some maybe formal scientific or engineering,
I think you're more of a scientist than I am an engineer.
Training or background has that kind of scientific method drilled into them.
Yeah. And
that kind of, I would say, influences quite a lot of your outlook on life, to be honest.
Oh, that's profound.
So I think so. I think
have you experimented with the upbringing of your children and treated them differently?
Well, I kind of am, actually. I kind of am. Well,
see which one works.
Let's not go further down there. Social engineering,
yeah. But I think it does mean that this appeals to us quite a lot. This idea of testing from a marketing point of view, because I think a lot of marketing people see testing as important, but haven't had the luxury of necessarily some of that scientific training, which backs up the theory. If you said P equals 0.5 to a lot of marketeers, they wouldn't necessarily know what you're talking about, but I know that you know what I'm talking about. So.
Yeah, and I think it's, like I say, it's I did some lectures at the University of Shrewsbury on transferable skills for scientists, and that's always the one thing I point out is that once you've learned to think scientifically about how to test something, so come up with your hypothesis, design your experiment, run it, record the results, come to the conclusion, etc. That has got so much application across anything in life, really. And particularly, I think, and this is a growing trend, around marketing. So it's not just about making pretty pictures and all that type of thing.
The colouring in department.
The colouring in department. It's really about, okay, what works for a given audience at a given time.
It's more so, especially if you think of marketing as lead gen, it's a science.
Yeah.
And yet one of the surprising things that Hannah found for us in researching for this episode is that of all the tests done, according to a website that helps you do this testing, 88% of all the tests are inconclusive.
Yeah, I think that doesn't necessarily surprise me, given what we've seen. And I think that is largely down to data sets that people have. I think, again, if you're, Diary of a CEO size and you're testing your data on a user base of 4 or 5 million or something, you're going to get statistically significant results from that.
Yeah.
If you've got an email list of 500 people and you're doing an A/B test on that, you're probably not going to get something that is, you can hang your hat on being statistically significant.
Well, I think you've got to think differently when you've got a smaller data set of how to get something that you could perhaps get meaning from, given the size. If you're only sending an email out to 500 people rather than 5 million, you've got to think a bit more about it. So don't be too subtle for a start. If you're trying to find the nuance between the colour of one call to action button and another, you're not going to get enough of a difference. 250 cent each of those two versions. But if you're bolder, if you fundamentally change something, we talked about subject lines fundamentally changing, or the content of an email fundamentally changing, you might then get something from it. But you're right, with such a small data set, you can't afford to be too nuanced and too subtle about it.
And I think maybe some of those tests are inconclusive if you are doing kind of multivariant testing. So by that, don't change your headline and image placement and CTA and everything at the same time. You have to have some form of design or experiment, which is back to that kind of scientific method and going through a process of that to say, in this email, we're testing.
What's the sample size you need before? Because that's another finding that Hannah came up with, that fewer than 10% of tests have any more, if they're doing a test at all, any more than 2 variants. It's an A/B test. Why not an A/B/C/D test? Well, I think the answer is in what you just said there. If you've got a relatively limited data set, then you haven't got the luxury of doing an A/B/C/D/E/F test. You're barely going to get through your A/B.
Yep.
So I understand that if you have got the luxury of it, or you're going into, and we're going to talk about other platforms to do that on, where you've got a lot of people that might see it, even if they're not your followers, then maybe think about that a lot more. So I think,
the first point there is that, does that mean you shouldn't test if you've only got a small data set? No,
it doesn't. No.
There should be a philosophy and culture of how are we actually testing our content?
Yeah.
How are we working out what works, what doesn't, so that we can maximize ROI?
And test often. If you've only got 500 people in your email, but you're sending an email out every week, make sure that that's part of a longitudinal test. Maybe instead of on the day 250 get each. I know you've got other variables coming into play, but maybe 500, all of them one week get one version, and all of them the next week get another version, or a different time of day or a different day of week. So you have to maybe play the long game in terms of building up your data set. So test often and use what you've got by repeating it and confirming it.
Yeah.
And there's probably a good point there as well, that with these smaller data sets, there's a danger of coming up with what appears to be a conclusion, but it's not statistically significant, and you may not know that if you've not really examined that. So test it again. Make sure you can repeat your results, which, as a scientist, you will have
repeatability,
spent a lot of your time to do.
Big thing. So repeat again, and I think having a framework that you can work through. So having some kind of design of experiment, like this week we're going to test subject lines, and then we're going to work out which one of those works, right? So we pick that. Let's try that again, but now let's create another variant, which maybe let's do one email with an image in and one without, or something, and and build that picture up, which is going to be contextualized for your business and for your market. So this is where taking stuff just straight off the internet and saying, well, we know that if we send an email on a Tuesday at 10 o'clock, that's when the best time, well, it might be the best time for whoever did the research, but is it the best time for you and your audience? So it's those sorts of things where I think I would say if you've got limited data, just having the philosophy of testing is probably going to be beneficial anyway.
Yeah, just think about it from the beginning. And even the example you gave there, I think pick the things that matter to you more. So for example, if you're choosing whether to send your email at Tuesday at 10 o'clock or Wednesday at 3 o'clock, if the difference you're likely to get is of the order of 10 or 20%, it's within the margin of error of your testing. Why bother? Why not try and test something instead that could double or triple the engagement because you've changed the headline or changed the frequency of doing it or changed the color or whatever it is you are going to test for. Go for some bigger results than I've got a slightly higher open rate or click-through rate.
Yeah.
And of course, you can get data out there for day of week time anyway, because other people have already done this sort of stuff. May not exactly suit your industry. I get it. You might want to do it yourself. But if you can shortcut it, take theirs as a starting point and test something else instead.
Yeah. So I think then is it worth talking about, we're kind of working through a process at the moment of trying to test different bits of data, how we go about it. One of the things that we want to try and do at the start is work out, okay, we've got a load of ideas, we've got a hypothesis, shall we say, as to what content might resonate, but we don't actually really know. No. We've not really testing it. And none of this is, shall we say, an exact science, as it were. It's more about trying to work out, okay, what works and what doesn't work and build that picture over time. Now, for someone like the Diary of a CEO who have got a huge amount of data and people they can test on, they can maybe come to a conclusion on some of this in a matter of days, maybe hours, certainly over a week. They work out.
Grace in her interview talks about testing 100 thumbnails for any one particular podcast episode, and that's in the week or so leading up to the release of the podcast. So there must be dozens a day they're testing, and they see what works.
They've got a whole team who's dedicated to doing this, and it's amazing and it's great. You've got to have those people who are out there doing that, being the kind of the benchmark for everybody else. That, I think, for many SMEs are never going to have that level of resource or that market.
I bet you there's loads of marketing people listening thinking, I wish I had that audience. I think the challenge for people like us all in smaller, more human scale businesses is to work out how to do something meaningful in these smaller businesses. It's still relevant for an SME. You just got to work a bit harder at it. It's not as easy for you.
And you can take those best practices that someone out there at the front of the pack is doing. They've got the time and the ability and the resources to do the research. So, okay, what can you glean from that to then apply into your own business context? So one of the things they talked about was using TikTok to measure things. Now, there's like a lot of businesses, you talk to people, a lot of SME businesses talk about being on TikTok, and you really get the backlash on that.
Or the eye roll, yes.
But if you think about it from the point of view of saying the algorithm on TikTok is designed to reward engagement. So if you want to measure whether or not this piece of content versus this piece of content level of engagement, you can use TikTok to get a result on that very, very quickly. Now, you don't have to wait. You will probably get the result within about 1 to 2 hours.
I was going to say an hour. In a way that you definitely, for those businesses out there more used to using LinkedIn, you definitely don't get for that. You're only going to see stuff from your followers, from the people you follow, so the companies and the people you follow. Instagram, I think, has got a slightly better algorithm that it might recommend stuff that the people you follow also look at, but it's going to primarily prioritize the stuff that you've already.
Well, a lot of platforms are now moving towards that TikTok model where they're going to reward engagement, which is great news for many SMEs who don't have that following, because that will mean that if you can create great content, then you're going to be able to amplify your message exponentially.
Which sort of makes sense, doesn't it, from their point of view? Just because I like, let's say, the BBC, or I don't know, something fairly vanilla, and I then get my feed dominated by that, it's not necessarily all going to be stuff that has high engagement elsewhere. It might be a boring piece, but it's still going to prioritize it. I'd rather be introduced to something that has got high engagement levels, as long as it's in the general bandwidth of stuff I'm likely to be interested in. I don't need to see some South Korean clever dancing going on. That's whatever. But I do want to see business relevant stuff, of which there's an inordinate amount of on TikTok.
And I think the reward then is that you get rewarded now, and increasingly so, I think, as more platforms follow the TikTok's lead on engagement. You're going to get greater ability for SMEs to create content on those platforms that is going to be relevant and it's going to get seen. So
what's nice about that as well, especially for SMEs that aren't using TikTok either at all or much now, is that your test environment doesn't really cross-pollinate or pollute the other environments that you take more seriously. So if you really think your audience is on mainly LinkedIn, maybe a bit on Instagram, maybe a bit on Facebook, then doing something on TikTok is going to appeal to a different audience. It's almost like having a protected set of data that doesn't influence then what happens once you've got your result.
Well, and I think you've got to run the whole thing. So I would say go on TikTok and do your test a couple of pieces of content, see which one gets the engagement. Now we've seen probably 4x engagement on one piece of content versus another. Same content, just slightly revised. Now, okay, that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to map across into LinkedIn or somewhere like that, but we've at least got some data that says humans, if they are humans that are reviewing this, like this piece 4 times more than this piece. Okay, so now let's take that learning and move that into LinkedIn, test it on LinkedIn. So we're kind of refining the process all the time, and we'll keep refining it till because you're never going to reach a point where you've got absolute certainty that if we do it this way, and I think as well, then your content will become very formulaic. But it's about having that kind of process of saying, right, we're going to produce some content, we're going to test it in this environment, we're going to take those learnings and then use that to create content for other platforms where our audience actually more likely lives.
Just be aware that the audience on each platform may well behave differently. So don't take it as gospel that because it works on one, it'll necessarily work on the other. Apply some intelligence to it in the same way that I think you have to apply some intelligence to what is your measure of success. What is the, define the outcome at the beginning rather than running the experiment and trying to fit the results to your preconceptions. So is it, and we were talking earlier, is it about how many people say see one of our LinkedIn posts and click through to the podcast, or is it just watching 30 seconds of the short? It can be different. Or on YouTube, for example, is it sharing of it? Is it commenting on it? Is it just viewing it? Is it suddenly subscribing to the channel? Work out first what it is you're trying to achieve with it. And it may well be that it is something lighter touch. It's just viewing it, for example.
And I think as well, another benefit of having a testing process is that it does force you to look at the data. So I think a lot of times it's very easy to fire and forget by just throwing up some content on a LinkedIn post and there we go. Whereas if you're actually really saying, okay, well, what are we trying to learn from this? You're really going to look at the data. So we know that we get very different audience types at the moment if we put the same piece of content on TikTok versus YouTube.
Of course.
Now from our point of view, is that useful for the podcast or for Wellmeadow? Maybe not. But from a client's point of view, it could help.
It could do for clients. You're right, in different circumstances. But it even helped with us because we were really trying to find out of the audience where we have emails from, when we're doing email marketing, what might be more likely to encourage people to engage with the rest of our content, not just what's in the email. And we found in that experiment we did last week that not a subtle, a major change, a big change of the subject headline had an unpredicted result in what happens in the email. It had a higher open rate because the headline was more relevant, but it meant that people were also more likely to engage in other Wellmeadow content rather than the thing the subject headline took about. So that sounded counterintuitive. So now we've got to retest because that doesn't sound like we can easily explain that. So does that happen again? Should we do another test of that and work out whether that can be repeated?
But we also saw things like placement of articles in an email matter quite significantly.
Yeah, hugely.
All of the
100% of the clicks we got were for the first article, and even though there were another 2 or was it 3 beneath that, they got nothing, with the exception of the one right at the bottom, which was the one that we talked about in the subject line. So people were either going straight to the bottom because that's what they were coming in here and looking for, skipping over everything else, or they started reading. Some of them were taken in by the first thing they read, but then they remembered, oh, hang on, but I'm here to get something else, and went straight to the bottom.
So then back to things we were talking about around that was if you've got different buyer personas that you're sending your emails out to, you might want to segment your emails so that you've got, let's say from our point of view, if we're sending it out to our HubSpot cohort, our HubSpot marketing or advice or articles are at the top of the email, or consulting, you'd have consulting, or content. So it's about you've got to have a process that is robust enough that you can really test what you're doing, but it's contextualized for your business, and you're just bringing those insights into the next test, into the next experiment, so that you can just keep moving the dial in terms of what is and what isn't working. And over time, you
get a better and better view of what might or might not work. But don't be disheartened if you don't get the results you want straight away, because there's a large element of luck in all of this, how things get shared and how the algorithms work. So it could well be that you're doing all the right things and one day something unpredictable will go well for you, or something you thought would work doesn't.
I got an email from Neil Patel yesterday. I'm not sure it wasn't personal, but it felt like it, yeah. And he was talking about SEO and the improvements in SEO and how that can work. And he was saying in the first 6 months you might see a 10% increase in traffic, and then over the next 6 to 12 months you might see another, I think it was 15%. And they'd analysed over 1 million different websites or something for this. And so, but then over the next year, it kind of was a 46% increase, and all these are compounded. And then likewise for year 2 and year 3. So you've got to play a long game with some of this stuff. It's not going to happen. You're not going to just start testing it tomorrow and find out, okay, we've got the holy grail of our marketing here.
Yeah.
It is, about playing a long game. But what you were saying, the best time to plant an oak tree was
30 years ago.
30 years ago. But
second best time is today.
Yeah. So
good. I think the other point, just as a kicker as well, before we close on this episode, is that in all of this testing, make sure that you're still complying with your brand message, your brand style.
Yeah.
Don't go completely off-piste and do something which you are embarrassed about being out there in the public domain just because it was a test. You're still presenting the company in everything you do, so it still has to be consistent with the brand values. Good. Okay. Short, sharp introduction to the idea of testing from a marketing point of view there then. Hope you found that useful. That's another episode of the SME Growth Podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll be coming back to this subject, I think, in future and bringing some more data on it that we glean from some of our clients that are sharing it and our own experiments as well. So thanks a lot for listening. And as ever, if you found that interesting, please share that with your colleagues and friends and other people who run businesses that are trying to grow. In the meantime, good luck with your business.